make the sun burn through the night, and you could make the dead man come alive. If you could...
We are now in the exilic period, and because we're starting in Jeremiah, we'll be backing up just a little bit to where we have been most of the time in the last number of sessions we've had, in the time of tension when through multiple prophets the word of the Lord has been coming, that the unfaithfulness of God's people is now about to come on their heads, and they are going to have what is most precious to them taken from them, and though it should not be what is most precious. What should be most precious to the people of Israel in Judah? The Lord himself. But instead, what has been their most precious, treasured possession? Really a couple of them. Anybody have an idea of what has become? Heidi?
The ark?
Well, the ark was one of them, and was more relevant to the northern kingdom because of its being in possession in Samaria and in the tent of meeting, or a sort of a temporary temple in Samaria. But then that was lost in the north, but for the whole of the people, that was really their first, one of their first, I would say, things that they turned into an idol instead of God. And believed with it, which is something that picks up here in Judah and Jeremiah, believed that because they had it, they had the object, everything was going to be okay. As long as they have the possessions and the good things that God has given them, the things that he has given them, sacred things, then they're assured of blessings, and everything will go well with them, regardless of how they live and choose whether or not to follow the ways of the Lord fully or not. And Jeremiah actually makes mention of that, Heidi, so that's very important to Jeremiah in one of his most climactic moments, his temple sermon, when he's preaching about their faith in the temple. Because you say, we have the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. He says it 3 times because that was their whole faith was in the temple. And he reminds them of what happened then in Samaria in the ark. And if we don't make the connection there, we would miss what that meant for the people of Judah. It was a very scary thing to think about, what happened to the people in Samaria when the northern kingdom was taken. They had the ark, and yet still they were overtaken. And now just a few miles away from Samaria in Jerusalem, very similar situation has set up where the people of God believe, because of the possession of the promises of God with land and king, and especially the temple of the Lord, they are guaranteed prosperity and success. They have the temple of the Lord. And you see in this a tendency that comes up biblically, and I would say we could start to think about ways it has come after Bible times, where the good things that God brings to his people, and even the things that establish us in life and in the land, blessings and gifts and possessions, can become for us what we start to lean upon and look to, rely on and trust in instead of the Lord himself. And the temple of the Lord was not just important to the people of God, it was important to the Lord also. The temple was a huge part of the line of David and the presence of God in his kingdom, and it was a sign to the people and to the other nations. The temple of the Lord was there, and they were established in the land as God's people. And so it wasn't just that the people cherished it, it was precious to the Lord. He filled it with his presence and poured out his Spirit upon the dedication of the temple in Solomon, and it was a beautiful thing. And so it's not just that somehow the people have taken away from it something that it was never meant to be. But now they have begun to rely on the blessings of God instead of the God of blessings. And we will see that the Lord is not unwilling to undo, remove, get rid of even good and precious things when they get in the way of his own people. And in this case, the apostasy was so great that even his own people he was willing to remove from the promised land. And yet there were prophets and priests in the land who were saying to the people, this is Jeremiah's contemporaries, besides those we would look to as the godly ones, and they're the ones in Scripture, besides Nahum and Daniel and others who would have delivered a faithful word from God. There were other prophets and priests around the king saying, you will prosper. You have the temple. All will go well with you. Don't listen to Jeremiah. He's crazy. Why would they say that? What was it that Jeremiah was saying that they would then label him as someone who was an opponent to the king and was against? Jeremiah became labeled as one who was plotting against the king and was siding with the Babylonians. They came out with that politically in the court of the king. They accused Jeremiah of siding with the Babylonians, putting his life on the line, for which he sometimes came close to losing because of what was done to him and the way he was treated. What was it about Jeremiah, if you can remember from where we've been recently, as other prophets have done, what was it about him and what he was doing that would have upset the people so badly? Especially the religious and political establishment. The religious leaders were very upset, and the political leaders very upset with Jeremiah. Joseph.
Well, for one, he would have upset the king and the political people because he was saying the Babylonians are going to come, they're going to take you captive, and then that would have upset the religious people, the false prophets, because then that would have made them either look like liars or saying that they're not real prophets of God, if in fact what he was saying was true. And it goes so far as to even he comes in with an object lesson where he has a yoke on him, and one of the prophets cut it off him, and God killed that prophet for that false prophet.
That's one of two messages, the themes of Jeremiah's messages that gets set up and sets Jeremiah up for trouble in the land. The first message was the Babylonians are going to come, and they are going to win, and they are going to take you over, and there will be great loss of life and great destruction in the land, and what you see now and who you are and your hopes and your dreams and your expectations for the future of your children in the land will all be lost for a period of time. Does anyone know how long the time was? 70 years. Yeah, 70 years. So that was extremely offensive to say that you are all of your expectations and your hopes and your confidence is going to be taken from you, and the enemies of God, the Babylonians, these wicked and godless people are going to come in and have their way with you, when the prophets and the priests in the land, where other prophets and priests were saying, don't worry about it. The Babylonians will not be able to get inside of Jerusalem in the temple. So now Jeremiah's message was first of all offensive because of the content, and then it created a political and a religious game, you could say, because of it being in opposite of what the false prophets were saying. These false prophets and the priests that were around the king and around the rituals of the faith were speaking false prophecies that were not true, and the Lord gives Jeremiah very clear messages about that he delivers to them. You are saying you have received thus and thus from the Lord, and you're saying, I have had a dream. Don't say you've had a dream from the Lord when it's not from the Lord. He was in their face about that. And if that wasn't already enough to make Jeremiah unpopular in the land with the kings, several kings, and with the religious and political leaders that had so much power, he added to the message something that was even more offensive and shocking to the people. Not only will the Babylonians take what we value and treasure so much, including some of your lives, take away the future of your children, but you must obey Nebuchadnezzar. Obey the king of Babylon. Do not resist him. Do not fight him. Let him come in and take you because it is God's will for you, in the sense of his judgment that has now come because of the rebellion of the people. So Babylon is going to win, and you must submit to him. Just all the way offensive and rejected, except for a few moments when some of the kings turned an ear to Jeremiah for a brief moment to listen to what he had to say. But then the pressures of the politics and the religious climate that they were in, caused them to turn right back around and reject the word of Jeremiah. So let's look at some of the material here. I do this often. I get really into the story, and then remember we have some biographical things to look at, and other things about the book itself. The prophet Jeremiah, what do we know about him as a person? His name means Yahweh establishes, and possibly Yahweh throws or hurls. It's a very fitting name for what was about to happen to the people. Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet and was primarily a prophet of doom. We don't like that word very much. Doom. He was a weeping prophet because he was not at all happy with retribution on the people, on his own people, and on the temple of the Lord. He was not at all happy in that. He did not find any kind of satisfaction, even that his own word that he said was from the Lord was upheld and proven to be true when all of the other prophets and priests' words were proven to be false. That was not a source of joy to Jeremiah, not at all. It broke his heart, and he was overcome with sadness and grief for what was coming on the land by the judgments of God. And so he is often called the weeping prophet. And from that we get the book of Isaiah. Here's three, and you could add a fourth, and I think we should. But the first three are sword. What does that signify? Death. The sword of Babylon. Famine. People would be starved, destitute during the siege. And pestilence. Disease that comes in during the sieges of a city. Disease sets in, and people begin dying from all kinds of things being spread around. And we could add a fourth word, and that fourth word is one that is familiar to us in the prophets, and it's the future hope. What is a word you would say could be added that we have for a future hope? Redemption. Yeah, redemption. And we get that theme, Jared, in Jeremiah again, that God will save for himself, for his own desire and love, and because he promised it to David, King David, he will save a remnant of the people that he will reestablish, and he will build back up, and will then come and be with and make them safe and secure in the land. Redemption. He will redeem them. And that is a picture we get again in Jeremiah of Messiah. That a servant of the Lord, a ruler of God's people, will one day come and will be in the midst of the people, and he will make them secure forever. And we know, as we look back, and as we are able to interpret scriptures and look at them in the light of the New Testament, we know who that is, and that's Jesus. And Jeremiah even speaks of a day that will come when the Lord will bring a new covenant to the people. He will make a new covenant with his own people. Says it in explicit terms. And we have named the second half of our Bible after those same words. The New Testament, the new covenant. And so we could add redemption to those three key words, and that makes it a little more nicely rounded than just doom. But we need to understand this message of doom that is in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah himself was a Levite. He was the son of Hilkiah, possibly, and I want to say most likely, the high priest who found the book of the law in the days of Josiah, when Jeremiah would have been a younger person. God's calling on his life Jeremiah's life, encompassed his family connection and generational ministry. Jeremiah is one different than Amos. Amos was called into the prophetic ministry out of being a fig tree farmer. Remember? He was a farmer, called into the ministry out of that. Have you ever heard our own Dr. Miller's story of being called into the ministry? Have you ever heard his story? Any of you? When he was driving a tractor or maybe a combine, and the power of the Holy Spirit fell on him as he was making sure the lines on the farm field were straight. And the power of the Spirit came on our own Dr. Miller, and he began to hear the call of the Lord while he was driving the tractor on the farm. And the Lord was calling him out of what he was very happy to take on in his family, continue the heritage of farming. And the Spirit of the Lord had something different. And that was the story with Amos, but it's a different story with Jeremiah. We see the Lord using family line and heritage. It is not just because you may have had someone in your family who was in the ministry, or your dad, or a close family member, and you also have been called into the ministry. Sometimes little sneaking thoughts can come in. Well, maybe I only think I'm called because someone in my family, or my dad, or my mom was called into the ministry. Has anybody ever had one of those doubting thoughts about their call before? Okay, thank you. I've had that before. My parents were not ever in vocational or professional ministry. They led different ministries and churches and different things. My mother traveled with Jews for Jesus, and she would speak in some of their things. And I at times have thought, maybe I just feel like I'm called by God because my parents talked about the Lord so much. And then what happens is you can start to say, maybe the call isn't real. Maybe I just am mistaken. And that's why it's so hard to serve the Lord. You see what can happen. And we see with Jeremiah someone whom the Lord had planned on being in a family that was associated with the work of the ministry to God's people. And this formed him and prepared him for his call. So we see here, even in the Old Testament, this mix of people called out of something that didn't seem at all to be heading towards ministry. And then someone as important as Jeremiah, who was in a family, who had ministry leaders in it. God does both. And his calling is just as real and legitimate for both. Somebody said amen. Right, Lisa? Yeah. His calling is real. And yet his ministry was unique. He did not fulfill the role of Hilkiah. He had a different call because God had a plan for him and his generation. Something important to know, this is helpful with the book of Jeremiah. It's a big book and it covers a lot, and it's hard to follow if you're trying to look at it chronologically. The book of Jeremiah is not written in chronological order, and that does not mean that, oops, Jeremiah wasn't paying attention. That's not what that means. It is written thematically, and chronology was not important in the compiling of the prophecies and the historical accounts that are there. And that will help when you're trying to make sense of the dates and the occurrences of kings, and why is Jeremiah now talking about this king when he said he was serving him back here. It is simply a matter of him picking up similar themes in the prophecies that the Lord was giving him. We know that he ministered during the reigns of Josiah. These are the kings of Judah, the last kings of Judah. Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, who was the final king of Judah and was nothing more than a puppet king. Who can remind us what that means, a puppet king? What does that mean in the context of the people of Judah? Peter.
Puppet king was it was set up by the other government, and they would just kind of do what they wanted. Like they had some power, and they were like kind of royalty, but they weren't really in the true sense.
That's right. They did enjoy some of the privileges and the luxuries of royalty and renown, which seems usually to have gone to their heads, but they didn't really have power as a king of the people. Puppet, we say, because if Nebuchadnezzar said, do so and so, and move your hand left, then this king of Judah was required to move his hand left and do what Nebuchadnezzar told him to do. Yeah,
So
Joseph.
when we see the New Testament with Pilate, would Pilate be considered a puppet king, or was that something different in the Roman system?
You mean Herod?
No, I was referring to Pilate.
Pilate was, I think, more of like a provincial ruler in a province who was nervous of upsets and things because it would look bad and he could get in trouble. I'd probably be executed if the emperor was in a bad mood when he heard about it. But you have a similar thing with Herod, though, the puppet king, who had all the trappings of being a king, the paraphernalia, but wasn't really king at all. And nothing like the godly kings that God intended to be rulers of his people. Nothing at all like the Lord himself. Yes?
Were the people under these puppet kings, were they aware that they didn't actually have a whole lot of authority? Or did they consider them to be like legit?
I think that enough was given to the king that he was allowed to be there and be in power, that it helped them keep their sense of society and culture. But I think most of them would have known that this was a Babylonian now version, like we were like the Babylonian Hebrews almost. Like we're the Hebrews, we are the people of God, but we are ruled by the Babylonians. But in the day-to-day, they saw their king, they saw their temple and their court and their sacrifices, and they were able to keep that sense of self and identity. So, yeah. So I would say they felt it was legit because it was ongoing day-to-day. But most would be aware that it wasn't really like the days of David and Solomon. And it really wasn't at all like that. The glory days of Israel were gone. It's a great question. He ministered during these kings, leading up to, he's one of the prominent prophets leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, which is how the story ends, at least for the political history of Israel, but not at all the spiritual history. Thank God. And because the spiritual history of God's people did not end with the fall of the kingdoms, you and I are in the faith today because of the promises that carried after this disaster. Aren't you think? Kind of helps us to say, ooh, that's very important, even though the political history. We know from chapters 40 through 44 that his ministry continued while in captivity, lasting a total of about 47 years. So he had a very long ministry, not quite as long as the prophet Isaiah, but a very long ministry, a major prophet in the sense of the size of his book in the Bible and the amount of material we'll have, but also in the length of his ministry. His book is richly loaded with important passages about godliness, righteousness, the ways of the Lord, and important history for establishing the reliability and authority of the text and its place in the canon. Archaeology will line up with the book of Jeremiah and the history of the kings of Israel in a big way. The kings that are claimed to be in the land and the battles that took place and some of the treaties and the agreements and the exchanges. Archaeology in many ways, and even in current times, new discoveries continues to back up the history that is in things like the book of Jeremiah, where we have so much, we have such a critical period. Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Ezekiel, and Daniel ministered at around the same time, but in different spheres of influence. They each had a unique call. Some of them have very similar messages, and we can see the Spirit of the Lord. When you look at that, you see the Spirit of the Lord upon his people, speaking to his people similar things, and you also see the prophets learning from each other and knowing one another and associating, like Daniel, who mentions the prophet Jeremiah and his prophecies. So there wasn't some kind of an exchange that was taking place between them, and they were concurring to some degree as they were hearing from the Lord and what God was saying to the people, but in very different spheres of influence. Here's a basic outline of the book of Jeremiah. 45 minutes, my voice is going to hold out. Chapter 1 through 25, prophecies about Judah and Jerusalem under various kings. These were prophecies that many of them, they did not want to hear because it was about the heart of the land, Judah and Jerusalem. Don't tell us that we're going to lose these. These assure us of God's blessing, and this is what God has given us, and this is the sum total of who we are. They didn't want to hear it. Chapters 26 through 45, a collection of narratives from his life and ministry. We get historical interludes, I call them. Chapters 46 through 51, prophecies against other nations, the enemies of God. And chapter 52, the end of the story, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. It's like a historical, a closing chapter that records the prophecies of Jeremiah were true. And it puts a stamp on there, and it's not just a stamp in the Bible, it's historically known. The word of the Lord was with Jeremiah, this prophet that believers call Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah. And he was not with the false prophets and the priests who were saying it would not happen. So chapter 52 gives us these closing theme of truth and validity to the word of Jeremiah. Let's talk a little bit about Jeremiah's calling. Jeremiah was assured of supernatural courage and boldness because he had a very difficult call. He would be called to rebuke and announce judgment upon the people. And the Lord encouraged him that he would be with him and would supernaturally give him courage and boldness and enable him to fulfill his task. Have you ever had something to do for the Lord? Maybe it was giving a devotional or leading something or approaching someone that you believe the Lord gave you a word or speaking in a service or something, and you felt nervous. Anybody? Okay, I can lift both hands, both feet, wiggle my toes, and say I've been there so many times I can't count it. And it's words like these to Jeremiah that can come back to us in so many other places in Scripture where we see God who is judge, he is king, he is ruler, he is savior, but he is also encourager of his people. He's encourager. He is the great encourager of his own. Sometimes he uses other people. Sometimes he drops it in our own spirits and minds. And we go to places like this and say, yes, Lord. Though my heart is pounding and I'm nervous and I'm sweating, you are with me. And even while I still feel afraid, I can do it because you're with me. You know how many times I've said that? In some critical ministry moment or something. Chapter 15, some of the things about the calling of Jeremiah. An uncompromising trust and obedience in the Lord, obeying God. He was uncompromised. Despite the fact that he was suffering, sometimes wondering, why are you having me suffer so much because I am obeying you? He was suffering at the hands of the leaders, and the religious and political leaders. And even in spite of his own broken heart over the destruction that was coming upon his people. Chapter 15, we're still in some of these moments of Jeremiah solidifying his calling. The Lord promises Jeremiah that he would care for him and he would support him in the midst of the crash of Judah and Jerusalem. And it was literal crash in every way. The temple, the fire and the destruction of the temple that Nebuchadnezzar and his commander Nebuzaradan brought upon their most cherished and treasured possession. But the Lord promises Jeremiah, I will take care of you. Chapter 15, 19 through 21. Does anyone know how this was fulfilled specifically with the destruction and the crash? It's very interesting. Joseph.
When everything went downhill, right? Wasn't Jeremiah put in prison, and then everything was like all the stuff was taken away to Babylon, and that's how he got out?
Well, there was someone, I have in mind someone specifically that made sure he was taken care of.
I want to say it was a guard of some sort, wasn't it? Or a centurion?
Yeah. From
Babylon.
Babylon. This is the point I wanted to make. This word, and it was certainly fulfilled in other ways, God's provision and life and protection in other times, that he was thrown in prison and thrown in a cistern, and he was abused and persecuted, and God continued to preserve his life and gave him advocates even in those politically thick times. He had an advocate. But specifically at the crash of Judah, the crushing blow of Nebuchadnezzar, we find, and I believe it's right there in, the promise is there, but later on, Nebuchadnezzar had heard of the ministry of Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar, the ruthless king of Babylon, had heard of his ministry and heard that he was telling the people to obey Babylon. Now, naturally, Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have been very upset about that. And he had heard of this. And Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm trying to find where it is here. We are in his calling here. Nebuchadnezzar himself gives orders to his commander, Nebuzaradan. Nebuzaradan was the commander of the armies of Babylon, and who was the one that carried out the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah, the temple. Nebuzaradan carries along the command of Nebuchadnezzar to give special care and make sure that Jeremiah is taken care of and that he is allowed to remain in the land with the poor people, to be someone that is a point of reference for them, so to speak, and having a hard time with my words, continue to lead in many capacities the remaining. It seems strange to any of you besides me that the word of the Lord is fulfilled in a very direct and specific way at the most climactic moment through Nebuchadnezzar and his extremely violent and ruthless commander, Nebuzaradan, who protects Jeremiah and gives him space to live and says, you may live in the land and shepherd your people. And now Jeremiah's ministry moves from being a prophet of doom and gloom to being very much like a pastor or a shepherd of a lowly and poor and destitute people who need to try to survive in the land without their leaders, without their all the things that they once looked to, and their systems and their policies and their financial systems. All of that is gone. And they're there just to survive off the land. And yet you see the Lord giving even his own remnant a shepherd in Jeremiah, and then fulfilling his word to Jeremiah through Nebuchadnezzar. I just find that so interesting, the ways of the Lord that make me stop and say, oh my, surprises in the ways of God. Chapter 16. The cost of Jeremiah's obedience, or at least the call of God to him, was that he would not be allowed to marry, and he would not be allowed to, what follows that, to have children, because of the sense of urgency of the hour that he was in. He didn't choose to be born then. He didn't choose his own calling. God chose him, and God had him raised up at that time. And one of the messages was, there will be nothing here for your children in this land. They will not have the future that you are expecting for him. To the people of Judah, this is the message. And one of the signs of that was that Jeremiah himself was not allowed to marry and have children, so that they would see there won't be anything here for your children. And yet at the same time, the day would come when people would return and they would be allowed to reestablish in the land, not in their children's future, or even really most of the grandchildren. But the day would come. And so Jeremiah bought land. He bought land, said, I am going to keep this land because the day is going to come when we are going to be allowed to return and reestablish. I have received the word of the Lord. He will restore a people here. And so that property is mine, because one day my people will live on that land. And yet the big cost of his call here, one of the costs, was a life of celibacy and singleness. Some of the themes, main themes in Jeremiah's book. We've talked about this, doom. Also, chapter 17, ungodly alliances. The people and the kings were afraid, naturally afraid of Babylon, on a roller coaster with their response to that as Jeremiah and other prophets were speaking to them. And they began to look to Egypt as an ally. The ever-failing ally that the people of God shamefully would return to even after the history they had with Egypt and God delivering them out of the hands of the Egyptians. Looking to a godless foreign power to protect them from Babylon when all along who they needed was the Lord in their midst. And that didn't last very long. So he looked to Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar stops what he's doing with Nebuzaradan and his army, turns away from Jerusalem for a brief time, attacks and wins against the Egyptians, and goes right back to the task of overtaking Judah. But the Lord gave messages to Jeremiah that it was going to happen anyway, and it was an ungodly alliance to turn to Egypt. Another important theme, the potter and the clay, chapter 18, puts in the mind of, in ancient times, potters and their wheels, how they would spin. Remember, they didn't plug them into the wall and hit the red on button. Didn't do that. They had, with their feet, they would turn the wheel, and the clay would spin, and they would shape it and mold it. And part of this message that comes through this picture of God as the potter and we are the clay. If God is the potter, the one spinning the wheel and putting shape to the vessel that he's making, and we are the clay, what does that say to us? What are some of the messages that we get out of that? Some of them are very heartwarming and some of them are startling. Does anyone know what any of the potter and clay themes are? What that meant to them? What kinds of things does it say? Heidi?
God is molding us into people that he wants us to be.
He's molding us. He's the one that's shaping us. That's very encouraging to think God is the one who's shaping us. And he's making us, he's in charge of what we're becoming and the shape of his people and the design and what we will look like. It's God who is the one that is molding us. Peter?
After that, he put us through a fire to refine us.
The refiner's fire. That's right. The fire of the baking and the refinement and the finishing touches, and there's a fire to it. Very good, very good. Yeah. And it burns sometimes. Hot. The furnace is hot. Angelica.
Well, oftentimes too, as a potter, when you're molding this into like a vase or a bowl, if the shape gets misshapen, sometimes it'll even collapse into itself, and you get this blob. What you do is you would just stop, pick it up, move it back into, shape it back into a ball and start over, which is what you have on the screen, but yeah, and then he'll start shaping it again.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's right. That's what it was. It was a normal thing for a potter. It might suddenly warp into a wrong shape, and he would have to start over. Sometimes the potter would realize, this isn't what I was planning on. This is not what I wanted, and smash it down. But at that moment of smashing the clay, what was coming to be being crushed, the potter doesn't pick up the clay and throw it out. The potter starts over to build anew. And this is this theme that was coming through this picture of the potter and the clay. There was a smashing that was coming, but he's not going to throw it out. Yes, Sam.
Usually, like, they're shaping, there's extra clay on what they're trying to use to, like, take pieces and, like, put it to the side, like, take off pieces.
Mm-hmm. There was, we could say, a waste or parts, leftovers that aren't used anymore, and there was certain, or excess. Yeah, we can start thinking of these, and there was certainly that kind of thing with the history of his people. things that were allowed to be added on that needed to be, that he got rid of. But he keeps the heart of it to start new. The potter and the clay. He is the potter, his people are the clay, so he's shaping us. Have any of you ever had a smash, start over period with the Lord before? You can, maybe you smile about it now, but when it happened, you didn't even know if God loved you anymore. You wondered. Anybody? You've been smashed, and the Lord said, came through and said, I still love you, and I want to do something new, and we have to start over here. Aren't you thankful? He didn't throw you out. He doesn't throw us out.
Like compare that to the New Testament, like in John 15, when Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches, and every tree that doesn't bear forth fruit, he has to like prune us. We go through that tunnel where he has to like take off those rough spots and throw them into the fire, you know.
Yes, it's very similar to the pruning. Exactly. There's sometimes a removal and taking away what is and undoing. Pruning is, and we're actually going to talk about that in the New Testament. That's one of my favorite classes in the New Testament course when we talk about pruning. Smashing to start over to build what is in his heart and mind again. And he has a good shape in mind for you, to make you a vessel that carries his presence, his promises, and his truth. And he wants it to be formed according to his plan. He's willing to push and to shove and to redo with us, even when we don't want that to happen, but he's doing good things. Joseph.
So just about Babylon, if it was able to go straight from Judah to Egypt and then back to Judah, how big was the army of Babylon?
How big was the army of Babylon?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Anybody know any of the history of the size of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and their army at the time of Nebuchadnezzar? Because Nebuchadnezzar was kind of a revival, Babylonian revival king. I don't mean that like a Christian revival. No. Like a Babylon. So I know things were getting bigger and better, and he was super powerful. So, glorious king of Babylon. I don't know the size. Anybody have any history on that? History buffs? No?
Google's being a little funny.
Size of the king. What's that?
Google's being a little funny.
Okay.
On
Yeah.
the internet, anyway.
Be a neat thing to find out. Another big theme that, especially in the personal vignettes, the little stories that Jeremiah gives us of instances in his life during this time, we see this theme of conflict. Jeremiah was constantly in conflict with false prophets and religious liars. Jeremiah's ministry placed him in the direct path of wrath and rejection from those who had become hardened to God in his ways and carried on an empty religious formality and lies. They were able to say, and it was so believable, the temple of the Lord is here. The rituals of the Lord, the blessings of God, they are here in our land. People, be encouraged. All will be well with you. And then they carried out the rituals, the sacrifices, the rites, and the ways and the worship of God's people, including other deities and other religions. But rituals do not equal real relationship, do they? You can carry on the form of godliness. This is what they were doing. And everything looks just like it's written on paper to do. Sacrificing the animals, pronouncing prayers, reading psalms, praying over the people, blessing over the people. Here's what is most dreadful. Speaking the name of Yahweh over all that they were doing, including as if he approved of their syncretism of pagan rituals and things. And then telling the people, see, we are still the people of the Lord doing all those things. Rituals do not equal relationship with God. As a people of relationship with God, there are rituals that we need to do. There are habits and disciplines. We refer to them usually as Christian disciplines. The things we do and the habits and the way we form our rhythms of life. We worship the Lord. We are people of prayer. We meet together. We give and we live sacrificially. We live the way of the cross. We follow the Lord and we obey, and there's things we do. But the form and the ritual does not equal relationship. It's the heart of it that they were missing. They had all of that stuff, but they did not have a real relationship with the Lord. Empty formality and lies. Chapter 21 brings us to this time of the climax of the history. It seemed that there was hope for a time. Jeremiah had an inroad with Zedekiah, the puppet king, the last king. And Zedekiah, it seems, appreciated Jeremiah for who he was. I mean, goodness, he was willing to put his neck on the line all the time. And even after getting in trouble and being abused and persecuted, he would stand right back up and continue to do what the Lord told him to do, despite the rejection and the persecution. So it seems that Zedekiah had some kind of respect for him and really wanted, and in some ways really believed even, that Jeremiah, that there was truth to what he was saying. You should obey the Babylonians. Submit to Babylon. They are here by the hand of God. But ultimately, the political pressures and the fears and the sin in the court of the king and in the kingship and in the people won out. And Zedekiah very quickly turned right around and rejected the word of Jeremiah. Chapter 23 is one of our messianic chapters. Though the kingdom would fall and the people will be lost, God will one day raise up a branch, a Messiah that would restore God's people who were now about to be reduced to a tiny remnant. And we have this appearance in Jeremiah's ministry of the message of Messiah, that a day will come when a righteous ruler in the line of David will come to the people of God, and he will establish them in safety and security and in righteousness. It's called the branch here, and he's given other names in Jeremiah. And that is the message of Messiah. Carries on even in the ministry of Jeremiah. Chapter 34, he listens briefly to Jeremiah. We talked about that. 37, we talked about that. He looks to Egypt, and Babylon does away with that alliance very quickly. Jeremiah is thrown into a cistern. He's accused of siding with Babylon. And then the fall of Jerusalem in chapter 39. Babylon wins, comes in, and takes over. It's chapter 39 where we find out that Nebuchadnezzar was aware of Jeremiah's ministry. He had been thinking about it clearly. He had been thinking, and then had given orders to Nebuzaradan, you look for that guy Jeremiah, and you make sure, don't kill him. You know, and in a war like this, if you don't give specific instructions for certain people not to be killed, when this kind of battle came into the land, if there wasn't a special order put on someone's head to protect that person, you might as well consider them as good as dead in these kinds of warfare. And so Nebuzaradan is given the command, and he leaves Jeremiah to be a shepherd with the people among the poor, and to serve Gedaliah, who is another puppet ruler. And then we have this confusing stuff that starts to happen. Gedaliah, who was put in place after the captivity, left with the poor people, obeys the word of the Lord through Jeremiah, which is still, be obedient to Babylon and you will prosper. You will live. Obey Babylon. Gedaliah, this temporary puppet ruler, follows. But then Ishmael, who was loyal to Zedekiah and was in the royal line, remember Zedekiah, his eyes are gouged out right after he watches his sons slain in front of him, and then they gouge out his eyes and they take him off to Babylon. Ishmael was loyal to Zedekiah, and so he kills Gedaliah, who was obeying Jeremiah. Someone was finally listening to Jeremiah. And he gets killed. All of his followers, his supporters. And so Ishmael suddenly tries to take power, to rise up, and he obviously has in mind that he's going to do something to one day overtake or get free of Babylon. And then someone named Johanan comes in, confronts Ishmael for what he has done. Ishmael flees. And now Johanan is in the place of Gedaliah as a temporary ruler in the devastated land with Jeremiah and with the poor people. And he listens momentarily to Jeremiah's message, which is, what's Jeremiah's message that he keeps giving over and over?
Obey Babylon.
Obey Babylon. Johanan, obey Babylon and you will prosper. He seeks the Lord through Jeremiah and he honors Jeremiah's ministry and his word that you will be blessed through Nebuchadnezzar. And then Johanan makes a promise with the people. They make a very solemn promise that they will obey the word of the Lord. And he turns right around and he disobeys and he says, we're out of here. We're going to Egypt. And by the way, Jeremiah, we're forcing you to come with us. And they skip town, they leave the land, and they head off to Egypt, of all places. But all they want to do was get away from Babylon. And they force Jeremiah to come with them into a secondary exile, you could say. And what do the scriptures tell us about Jeremiah's ministry? You would think at this point, if you were Jeremiah, you would just say, Lord, I give up. I don't get it anymore. I've done everything you've told me to do. My neck's been on the line. I've obeyed. And Jeremiah has some of these why God prayers. And now he's forced to go off to Egypt. And the scriptures tell us that he continues to shepherd God's people and deliver the word of the Lord to a rebellious people who are running from God. Though part of the word was, those of you who have come here to Egypt. So he continues to be faithful. He shepherds God's people. Though when they get in Egypt, they start to worship the Queen of Heaven, one of the Egyptian gods. And Jeremiah just continues to faithfully speak the word of the Lord to his people. Joseph.
What's Jeremiah's final fate?
He disappears in Egypt. Gone. Faithfully serving the Lord to his end. Not a real glamorous end to the life of a totally devoted servant of the Lord. That's not the point, is it? It's not the glory, vain glory. It's not the stuff we get that is the ultimate goal. It's not what we're going to get out of it, at least not now, although we have a promise of a future reward with the Lord. It's obedience and faithfulness to God. It's walking in the presence, treasuring the presence of God, no matter what the cost. And we see this with the life of Jeremiah. Lucas.
How could they make a revolution if they were under Babylon?
Yeah, right. Like, what was Johanan thinking? He was a rebel, radical, zealous, just, going to rise up. He was in the royal line, so he had connections and just wanted to probably go down in a blaze of glory, I guess. I would think. We are the people of God, and we're going to die trying. So go down in a blaze of glory. David.
One thing in Jeremiah that always kind of puzzled me was, I don't remember exactly where it is, but there is a part, or maybe a few, where Jeremiah says to the people on behalf of God that God will no longer hear your prayers. Does that mean that, one or two things. One, does that mean that if, on the spot, if they all just repented, that means that God would not lift his hand of judgment against them? Or does it mean that, God would no longer accept their sacrifices to atone for their sins, or could it mean both? Or maybe I'm taking it out of context a little bit, but I do know there's a passage in Jeremiah that says something like, God no longer hears your prayer, or something like that.
Yeah. If they obeyed the word of Jeremiah, they would prosper even in the captivity and rule of Babylon. But the word became if you continue to disobey now the new commands of God to obey Nebuchadnezzar, not only will the judgments of God, because of what your kings have done, Manasseh and other kings, the sins of the kings and the people had mounted up, and it was too late, the judgment was coming. But now you are refusing even to submit to the hand of God in judgment through Babylon. Now not only will this judgment come, but many of you will suffer and die because you refuse to submit to Babylon. So that was more of the larger message. And so I'm trying to, and I thought I had remembered, but it's not there, where that passage is.
I know for a fact it's in there. I've read this in Jeremiah.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of later on in the book, because the book kind of starts off, like, I feel as though, like, Israel still has a chance to turn back to God, but then they just keep rebelling, and then as time goes on, it's like, all right, now, it's inevitable, you know, that Nebuchadnezzar is coming to invade.
Yeah.
That's what I felt reading the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Someone else? See another hand over here? No? Okay. Yeah, I had, when you said that, David, I had in mind 49, but that's that's a collection of prophecies to the other nations, so, and their judgments. Joseph?
So, the Queen of Heaven, was this, because we see later on in medieval tradition, we see a reoccurrence of maybe not the same exact version of the Queen of Heaven, but was this thought of a Queen of Heaven preserved in Egypt, and also was it in Israel? Like, because we see early on in Jeremiah, he gets mad about the baby case of heaven. So was it an Egyptian thing brought in, or was it an Israelite tradition that they got from pagan nations and brought?
You mean the Queen of Heaven?
Yeah.
I don't know. As far as Egyptians' religions of this time, the ancient world of Egypt, I know more about their creation gods and myths than I do all of their. I know more just from studying the times of Genesis and things. I don't know, Joseph. Yeah, Queen of Heaven. Let's talk about the book of Lamentations. Just a few things here. And we just say most likely because of the conversation about who it might be in mind, but it's almost without question. And in tradition, it certainly is not questioned, that the book of Lamentations are Jeremiah's lamentations over Jerusalem being destroyed by Babylon. The pain that he felt at seeing the death, the bloodshed, the slaughter of families and people, certainly people that he would have known, and the crushing of the city and the temple, and the disease, and seeing a foreign power win like that and just take whatever they wanted. The book of Lamentation is written in the form of 5 psalms or poems that are psalms of mourning. It is like a funeral book. The book of Lamentations is put together like something for a grand funeral, a royal funeral. They are highly structured, very carefully prepared. They're not just raw emotion penned down in their full measure. There is raw emotion, and they are full of passion and heartache and faith and grief, wrestling with God, but they're very carefully prepared and structured in the forms of these mourning psalms. The book is read by Jews every year on the anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem at the Wailing Wall that's in Jerusalem. And the expressions of grief and upset are graphic, and they avoid a shallow positivism in dark times. Why am I saying that? They avoid a shallow positivism. One of the marks of contemporary society, and even in contemporary Christianity in the West, is positivity, especially American positivity. It's one of the marks of the American way. We just be positive, focus on the positive, don't let anybody see the negative, don't speak of the negative. Just be positive, put on the positive and the bright. You'll be more successful if you do that. And what happens is we can lose, with that loss of honesty and authenticity and even vulnerability in who we are when we struggle, we lose that openness with God and his people. And you see in the faith of Israel, the faith of God's people, and here in Lamentations, in the whole book, the willingness and the desire and even the godliness of expressing grief and heartache and all of its raw pain before God, questioning, taking it, but always in mind of submitting back to God and saying, God, I don't get it, but I know you're in charge and I know you can be trusted. And so there is this contrast many times when you read the Old Testament with what we will often see in popular or cultural faith today. There's a real contrast there. The positivism, whenever you have an ism, something is excessive, and I would say it is an ism, that suppresses the voice of pain. People aren't allowed to grieve for very long. It gets to be bothersome after a few days of hearing of someone's struggles. It's annoying in our culture. And this clashes with, in the Old Testament, it is a part of their faith. It is a part of their relationship with God, pouring out their hearts in total honesty. Joseph.
Why weren't these canonized as the book of Psalms opposed to being their own separate book?
I want to say because of their connection to Jeremiah as the prophet in the writings, the prophets. So, and I think that's in one of the ways, even the way it's canonized, they're connected together, and that helps us to make the connection there. And I think they deserve a distinct treatment in that way because of what they're about. The fall of Jerusalem, the glory of God's people in the earth, as far as the nation. Lamentations connects well with the blessings and curses that were spoken to the people in the law of God long before this day. And we see that it has come true. If you obey the Lord, and I'm shortening and summarizing here, if you do what he says, you follow after him with all of your heart and you obey his law, you will be blessed in the city and in the country. You will prosper. But if you reject the Lord, if you disobey him and turn away from him and turn to other gods, you will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. And everything you have and are will be taken from you. And we see now that the curses of Deuteronomy 28 have come true. Lamentations, it's good to view this not just as the sorrow of Jeremiah and his own pain, but also the grieving heart of God and how God feels. He hurts. Though he has been faithful to his word and kept what he said would happen. This is not a joyous thing to God. This does not bless the Lord. It is a grief even to the heart of God over his own children because he loves his people. They are prayers and poems of lament, like mournful or painful lyrics in a song with profound wrestling over extreme grief and pain. But they build to a bridge of hope through faith in God. That by following the Lord and by believing the Lord, we will stay in his mercy and we will see his restoration of his people. Okay. Well, that's all that I have for you today. Anybody have any thoughts or comments they'd like to share? No? How about we take a minute and read? Yeah, Jared.
One of the things cool, like, you're talking about how even though Judah was looking for an allyship with Egypt, God was still sending someone to speak for him to the people.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting. Like,
He loves his people. He always has loved his people, even when they're just complete rebels. And so that wasn't nice for Jeremiah to be forced to go. But it really fits with his call, doesn't it? It was just kind of more of the same that he had experienced through his lifetime. things didn't go according to what we would plan for ourselves. I would like this to happen to me and this, and then I would like this, and to marry this kind of a person and have, he didn't really get any of those things.
Here's a big, really starts to paint a picture of like what it actually looks like to do the will of the Father. Like it's not, you have your pastoral ministry job during the week, 8 to 5. That really is this arduous journey that you're taking every single day.
That's right, Jared. We don't ever want to begin to lean upon the comforts that come with the blessings of God in life and in ministry. And that's what you're referring to specifically, the danger that is there. To start to, it's not that we don't get to walk in the peace of God and be blessed and rejoice and have the fullness of joy in the Lord. We don't want to start to lean upon the easy times or the good things. We want to lean on the Lord and follow Him, because there are times when things that are precious to us will be taken from us. Not always, I don't think, just because we're being judged. Every bad experience we have is not a judgment of God necessarily, but I do believe there are things that are taken from us because the Lord knew if they stayed there, they would become number one, or they would be our source of peace and joy and our focus, and even worship, unless they're taken. I've had things taken from me. How about you, Jared? Yeah. And we see from Jeremiah, he's willing to take away what is most precious, even most precious to him. And that's a startling word. But what he's after is the heart of his people, that they would faithfully walk with him and obey him and live in his love and blessing. So it's great. Yeah, that danger is there when we're experiencing the good times in life, or good times in ministry, and our ministry or our position or the program we're leading or the church or whatever it is, and things are going well. We don't want to start to drift from that total dependence upon the Lord. Great point. Anybody else? A couple minutes. Okay. Blessings upon you.